when you hear the term forgotten war, usually the Korean War comes to mind, and rightfully so. It is sandwiched right in between the most destructive conflict in human history, that being World War II, and one of America's longest conflicts in Vietnam. Well, what if I told you that there was a conflict that is even more forgotten than the Korean War? And in fact, one of its most famous battles happened after the war. Well, that battle is the Battle of New Orleans, and today we're going to explore Chalmette Battlefield and see what we can learn, and hopefully shed some light on this really brief but bloody battle in the War of 1812. Now, before we get into the Battle of New Orleans, we're going to back up a few months and go over the events that led us to this point and to this battlefield. So in August of 1814, Britain and the United States began negotiations to end the War of 1812. However, the British issued secret orders to General Pakenham, who was in command of the British forces, to continue the war even if he heard of conversations of peace. Now, on January 8th, the British would launch their main assault. One of those assaults would be assaulting the American line just behind me. Another assault would be assaulting an American forward redoubt along the Mississippi River on the left side of the bank. And the final assault was supposed to take place on the other side of the Mississippi River, and that was called the assault on the right bank. Now, fortunately for the Americans and unfortunately for the British, that assault would be delayed. They had to dig a canal to the other side of the right bank, and it was delayed by almost 12 hours. Now, General Pakenham, being confident and slightly arrogant of his forces, they went ahead and launched the assault on the American lines, even though the right bank wasn't secured yet. Well, this is just an illustration that could probably give you a better idea of it than my words could, but again, you can see how the British had to cross the Mississippi, and it was delayed up to 12 hours, and they were set to attack the American line, which they did overwhelm, and to capture the artillery, and their goal was to take the artillery and fire on the American lines. And this is the general area where the British would assault an advanced American redoubt just before us. Just to kind of give you a layout of the land, we're right here, and again, here's the British assault on the left side of the line, and you can see your artillery batteries here, and you have the Rodriguez Canal, which was, I believe, like 15 feet wide and almost 8 feet deep. It was a formidable obstacle. And then you have Line Jackson just behind the Rodriguez Canal, and then the main British assault on the right side of the line along the cypress swamps here. So again, this is the general area where the British would assault the American redoubt, the advanced American redoubt, and they would actually take the redoubt. Now, they wouldn't be able to hold it because the Americans would counterattack, driving the British from this position and killing many of the assaulting force. And in reserve were your 93rd British Highlanders, which we're going to touch on, but they would be in reserve here, and they would be rerouted into the middle of the battlefield, which is where we're going to head now. So we've moved from the assault on the advanced redoubt, which is in that general direction along the Mississippi River, and we're back towards the middle of the battlefield. And while this is significant because seeing the American attack falter on the right side, General Pakenham ordered the 93rd Highlanders, which were in reserve back this way, to march across the open field, and they were commanded by Major General John Keane. And he was commanded to redirect British forces from the river. Nearly 1,000 soldiers of the 93rd Sutherland Highlanders, regiment led by Colonel Robert Dale, moved diagonally across the battlefield. It was a desperate maneuver, leaving the 93rd exposed to heavy fire. And when confusion among the advancing British troops forced the 93rd to halt in front of the American line, cannonballs and grape shot rained down, wounding Keane and killing over half the regiment's men, including Dale. So, and you can see the maneuver here. Assaulting, we are in this general area, but they were in reserve assaulting the forward American rampart, and they were moved from the reserves across the field, and confusion would stop them in the middle of the field. Now, this regiment was so disciplined They literally stopped in the middle of the open field and they were ripped to shreds. Didn't retreat, didn't advance, they just stood there. And they were picked apart until finally orders came from the British rear for the 93rd to retreat. So one of the sad stories here, again, they had over 1,000 men at their command and over half would fall here. That's a pretty staggering number. Now you probably can't see it on camera, but the field that the British were advancing on, it's extremely swampy and marshy. So you can imagine marching in your formations, it probably is not easy going, especially under heavy artillery fire from the Americans. Now we've explored this battle from the British side. Now we're on the American lines. So this sign is saying the advanced American redoubt and Battery 1 were in this general area where you see this levee here. On January 8th, this would only be a partially finished redoubt, and it was defended by U.S. regulars and Beale's Rifles, a militia unit made up of prominent citizens from New Orleans. During the attack along the river, British troops captured the redoubt, and again, the Americans pushed them back with fierce counterattacks. And you can kind of see on the map here, the U.S. Marines, U.S. Artillery Corps, and Beale's Rifles manning the advanced redoubt. And you have the Rodriguez Canal, and it ran all the way along the American ramparts here, also called Line Jackson. So this is pretty neat. I almost missed it. It's a little behind the American line here, but this is the site where Samuel Spots shot the first gun at the Battle of New Orleans, January 8th, 1815, and he was in the 3rd Regiment, 7th Battery Artillery Corps. So we're making our way down the American line, and I thought this was pretty interesting. This is the general location of Battery 2 and 3. Sailors from the USS Carolina that was damaged on the Navy battle on the Mississippi, they removed some of the cannons and manned them here. And also manning the cannons was Jean Lafitte's Barratarian Pirates, who manned cannons at Batteries 2 and 3. There is no evidence that Jean Lafitte himself was at the battle, but Batteries 2 and 3 were crucial in turning back the British attack along the river. To the left of those batteries were local militias, one made up of free men of color, the other of Irish immigrants, and members of the French Creole elite. And just to give you some of the armaments here, they had 2 24-pound naval guns, and Battery 2 had 1 24-pound naval gun. And then you have Jean Lafitte's troops, the Cross First Free Lacoste's First Free Colored Battalion, Plache's Uniform Battalion of New Orleans Volunteers, and you had USS Carolina Sailors. Now, I mentioned the American line ran along the Rodriguez Canal. This is giving you an example of what the fortifications would have looked like. So you have your Rodriguez Canal, which is right here, and it would be 15 feet wide, and I believe almost 8 feet deep, maybe 7. Yeah, it's 7 feet deep. And then you have your American rampart, which was 4.5 feet thick and 20 feet wide. So artillery hitting this position probably wouldn't cause much damage, and if it did, it'd be easily repaired. So we're making our way down the American line, leaving the advanced redoubt along the river, and we're heading towards the position where the main British assault would come against the American lines. And we're about to talk about why this attack was doomed from the start. Now, I'm not a weapons expert, but I just want to point out the obvious differences between a field cannon, which is this guy, and a naval gun, which is this guy. Now you can see the field cannon has bigger wheels, and it was lugged around with the infantry by artillery units. A little more mobile, and you have this guy, who obviously, just look at the sheer size of it, it's on a different type of carriage. And this helps save room on the cramped ships, but you can see these wheels here. They would not be conducive to going over terrain, especially a swampy terrain. You can just see how much bigger this cannon is than the field cannon here. We are near the 44th U.S. Infantry and Duquesne's Battalion, and this is Battery 4, or at least the general area of Battery 4. And Battery 4 was significant because it boasted the line's largest gun, a 32-pound naval gun manned by sailors from the USS Carolina, which had been sunk by the British on December 27. During the Battle of New Orleans, this big gun tore gaping holes in the ranks of the advancing 93rd, which we talked about a little earlier. They're the ones that essentially came to a halt in front of the American line. They didn't retreat, they didn't advance, they just stood there waiting for orders. Now to the left of this gun was the American 44th U.S. Infantry and Militia from Duquesne's 2nd Free Colored Battalion, who were men who immigrated from San Domingo. And to give you an example of what a 32-pound gun looks like, here it is. Again, pretty massive. So this is the position of Battery 5 and 6, and I just wanted to show you just the open field of fire that the Americans would have had. Again, they were reinforcing this line. This is Line Jackson, which is pretty much just earthworks, and then you have your Rodriguez Canal directly in front. And the British would be assaulting over open ground, starting in that general area. And again, they would be chewed up. So we are in the general area of the main British assault on the morning of January 8th, 1815. Now, we mentioned that this assault was doomed from the beginning, and that's for a couple of reasons. Well, you had your assault on the left bank that was delayed, so British soldiers never made it in time on the left bank before the attack on the right bank started. The assault along the river of the right bank initially succeeded, but then failed. And the assault here would obviously fail, but for a different reason. The main attack was supposed to take place in the darkness, but due to heavy fog, that attack was delayed. Now, when the fog would be lifted, most of the British formations would be exposed to the American line and the American artillery. And the American artillery began opening up, causing huge holes in the British ranks. Now, something that is staggering to me is the British were only in musket range for about 5 minutes in this battle. So they were advancing across this open field, taking tremendous casualties from American artillery, things like grape shot, which essentially turns your cannon into a giant shotgun. But when the British did at least get into musket range, they were only in that range for 5 minutes. And in fact, the 44th U.S. Infantry, 3/4 of their personnel didn't even fire their muskets. Now again, we're touching on the Rodriguez Canal that runs along the front of the American line. Well, in order to combat this, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Mullins, who was the British commander of the 44th Regiment of Foot, he was ordered to bring ladders so they can scale the canal and then in turn scale the ramparts here. Well, Mr. Mullins forgot the ladders, so when the British began assaulting this position, they literally had no means to get across the canal. Quickly after the attack began, most of the British forces fell into confusion. Most of the senior officers were killed or wounded, including Major General Samuel Gibbs, who I believe was second in command. Now, General Pakenham, who was commanding the British force, would also be mortally wounded. He would be wounded initially, fall off his horse, and while being helped back onto his horse, he was hit by another round of grape shot, and there he would be mortally wounded. So now the top of the British command system, Pakenham and Gibbs, lay mortally wounded on the field, and that only adds to the confusion. Now, the Battle of New Orleans would last right around 30 minutes, and in that 30 minutes, the American lost 13 soldiers, 39 were wounded, and an additional 19 were missing. Well, in this field before us, the British would have almost 290 killed, 1,200 wounded, and almost 500 soldiers were missing. So in 30 minutes, the British suffered nearly 2,000 casualties, which is a staggering number. Again, this goes to show you that with some competent leadership and a strong defensive position, you can easily defeat an overwhelming force. I mean, the British had the experience, they had the numbers, and they had the technology. Now, 3 days after the battle, the British would withdraw back to Mobile Bay. And on February 4th, 1815, they'd recapture Fort Boyer at the entrance of Mobile Bay. Now, General Jackson, on the American side, he was also planning his own preparations to continue the war. And when the United States ratified the Treaty of Ghent in February of 1815, that officially ended the War of 1812. Although the treaty was agreed upon in December of 1814, word of that treaty didn't reach this area until, obviously, February. So the British would then sail back to the West Indies, and the War of 1812 would end, and Jackson, because of his actions here and leadership, he'd be hailed as a national hero and kind of catapult him to his political success. Now, obviously, he was a controversial figure in American history for several reasons, but you can't deny the fact that Jackson's leadership and his tenacity really helped essentially save the America we know today. And that's always pretty interesting to me, because if the Americans have lost this battle, who knows how different the United States would have looked. So that was a brief synopsis about the Battle of New Orleans. You know, again, the War of 1812 is one of those wars that's kind of overlooked. It falls between the American Revolution, which is a widely known American conflict, and the American Civil War, which is an incredibly destructive conflict. So it was cool to get out and learn a little bit about this battle and learn that the impact that it could have had in shaping our country. So we'll catch you on the next one. Hope you enjoyed it. Just here in New Orleans, and I wanted to share this with you. This historic house. And on this site in 1897, absolutely nothing happened.